Hello viewers, so I suppose that since I did U.S. history in a nutshell, it behooves me to do European history in a nutshell. I suppose I should chop that down to be more specific. It's European history from the fall of Rome to the present. Since the history of Europe is particularly critical to understanding the history of the U.S., so this is why I made this video. So, when we say the fall of Rome, it happened in about 476 AD, and the reason that date is so exact is this was the date that the last Roman emperor in the West was deposed. He was deposed by a Germanic warlord. So, to give a little background on that, for centuries, I suppose about 200 years prior to this, the Roman Empire, which controlled most of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, it had been divided into two parts. The western part, its capital was in Rome, and the eastern part, its capital was in Constantinople. So the empire is divided into two parts, and each part had its own emperor. So the capital city of the western part fell for the last time, so the Roman Empire in the west slowly disintegrated. And after that happened, there were many reasons for the fall of Rome in the west. Barbarian invasions were part of it. The collapse of their currency, they debased their currency, and that caused economic chaos. There was political chaos. There were a number of army revolts and mutinies, a rapid succession of short-lived emperors. But, excuse me. So there are a number of causes there. So then, as the Roman Empire fell apart, we had a number of barbarian invasions. So you have Visigoths, Huns. Well, the Hun invasions were a little bit before the fall of Rome, but I'll include them anyway. Visigoths, Huns, Vandals, etc. So all these different barbarians just picked the Western Roman Empire clean and set up their own little kingdoms here and there. In Northern Europe, so in England, or the British Isles, I should say, this was, about the period from, say, 500 to 900 AD. You had the various Germanic tribes invaded. You had the Angles and the Saxons, and a couple other ones. So they invaded England, and since England, up until that time, had been part of the Roman Empire, it now became this new barbarian kingdom with the Angles and the Saxons sort of intermarried, and they called themselves the Anglo-Saxons. In the Middle East, starting in about 622, this was the founding date of. This is the date traditionally given to the start of the Islamic era. So Islam begins. This was a new monotheistic religion that began in the Middle East. The founder, named Muhammad. And so his religion spread rapidly over the next 100 years or so, conquered most of the Middle East and North Africa, and later began to expand into southern Europe and Spain. And it was poised to conquer most of Europe. But there was a very pivotal battle in the year 732. This was the Battle of Tours. So the Muslim invaders were defeated. And this is what kept Islam out of mainland Europe. So the Tours is in present-day France, and the victor of this battle was a Frankish warlord named Charles Martel. Now, while we're talking about the Franks, so the period of about 500 to, I don't know, about 900, you have the Franks. So this was a Germanic tribe that conquered the Roman province of Gaul, which today is mainly modern-day France, Belgium, parts of Germany and Switzerland. So they had their little kingdom there. And the greatest king of the Franks was a guy named Charlemagne, or you might hear it pronounced Charlemagne. And this is just kind of a garbled version of saying Charles the Great. Carolus Magnus in Latin. So Charlemagne built up something called the Holy Roman Empire, which was to come and go over the next few centuries. I suppose the obvious joke to make is the Holy Roman Empire was neither Holy Roman nor an empire. For most of its history, it was just a loose collection of squabbling petty kingdoms that occasionally were united under one leader. But for the most part, they were just smaller squabbling kingdoms. Back in the east, we have the Byzantines. So the Byzantines were the new nation or empire that came out from Eastern Roman Empire. And they battled with the Muslim Arabs, from about 700 to about 1000 AD. They were battling them. So the Byzantines held the Arabs held them back in the east from getting into southern and eastern Europe. On the religion side of it, as far as Christianity goes, up until about 1054 there was only one Christian church in Europe. But then in 1054 there was a schism or a split. And out of that split we have the Roman Catholics, which I'll just abbreviate as Catholics, and then you have the Orthodox. And the Orthodox Church, so the Roman Catholic Church, obviously from the name, centered in Rome. The Orthodox Church was centered in Constantinople. And the Orthodox Church later broke down into a bunch of sub-branches. There was the Greek Orthodox, the Ethiopian Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox. So this happened in about the year, these splits occurred mostly in the year 1000 to 1100 AD. So with the collapse of Rome and all this violence and conquest from barbarians, the main problem of the time was security. Since there were no large nation states or empires to count on for protection from barbarians anymore, a new arrangement sprung up called feudalism. So this was a system where peasants or serfs who were tied to the land and not allowed to leave it gave taxes either in the form of goods or money to warlords to protect them. And some of these warlords grew more powerful and entered into alliances with other warlords. and this is how we end up with the all those little medieval kingdoms. So one big warlord, so a powerful warlord would make alliances with smaller warlords. So what would happen would be something like in exchange for protection from the more powerful warlord, the lesser warlord would agree to help him if he was attacked. So this is how you get up, how they ended up with, the sort of medieval org chart where you have kings. You have a king, and then he has a bunch of lords. And below the lords, you have guys like dukes and barons and whatnot. And then at the very bottom, you have the peasants. And the main reason, as I said before, the reason for this security was, in addition to the Arabs tearing through southern Europe, or rather Spain and whatnot, and the various Germanic barbarians terrorizing mainland Europe, you also had the Vikings. So their heyday was about 800 to 1100. They're from northern Europe, and they conquered and raided all kinds of places in Europe, mostly the British Isles, the coast of France, but also they raided up into parts of Russia, what is today Russia, and Sicily. So they went everywhere. A group of Vikings conquered part of France, and that region became known as Normandy, which is derived from what they called them Normans because they were Northmen. So that's sort of where the name came from. The Vikings controlled England for a while, but they were kicked out by various English kings, Anglo-Saxon kings. And then in 1066, another important year, there was the Norman invasion of England. And William the Conqueror, a Norman warlord, defeated the English King Harold in battle and assumed control of England. And this was the last time that England was invaded by a foreign army. And the line of English kings set up by William has continued to the present day. I believe it's probably the longest unbroken line of monarchs in the world. This was the start of the English royal family. The start of the English monarchy as we know it today. Moving right along. In 1095, not too much later, this was the beginning of the First Crusade. So the Pope gave a speech, Pope Urban II, saying that it was the will of God that the Christians reconquer the Middle East from the Muslims and reclaim the Holy Land where Jesus had walked. And there were several other crusades that followed. So the next few, I believe there were, I want to say, 10 or so crusades. And so it was a period of about 200 years where these series of religious crusades against the Muslims in the Middle East. So for a time, there were a few short-lived kingdoms in the Middle East, Christian kingdoms, that they managed to conquer, but none of them lasted too long, and by about 1200, the last Christian kingdoms had been reconquered by the Muslims. But as a result of this, this is sort of the beginning of the enmity between Christians and Muslims, which has gone throughout the centuries. Starting around 1200, you have the Mongol invasions. Most famous Mongol leader, of course, Genghis Khan. So he ended up conquering, he and his descendants conquered a large section of Asia, a good bit of Europe, in the Middle East. So a huge amount of land. They nearly conquered Europe, but Genghis Khan died while the battle was going on, and so all the Mongol generals returned to Mongolia to elect a new leader, and that's what spared Europe from being conquered by the Mongols. The Mongol invasions, let's see, I guess that's about all I can say about the Mongol invasions. Going back to the Crusades for a minute, the Crusades, one effect they had was it led to increased trade and the growth of towns and cities. It's another thing that was happening in what are called the High Middle Ages. So, and also the Crusaders, when they came back with new ideas and technologies and a taste for the goods that existed in the Middle East. And then we have, after that, another important event. We have the Black Death. It's spread by the disease itself is the bubonic plague. It's the technical name for it. This was 1340s. There were several other lesser outbreaks of plagues over the next few centuries, but this was the big one. And it killed about a third of the people in Europe. And this was important because it sort of helped bring an end to feudalism. When the death of so many people led to a shortage of labor, and so the peasants were able to get a better deal. So this brought about, along with the Crusades, the rise of a merchant class. So 1300 to 1500, rise of trade, merchants. And of course, along with that came cities and towns. Of course, there were cities and towns before the Black Death, but the process of people moving into cities and away from the countryside accelerated in this period. And then we come to the Renaissance, which means rebirth. I think I have that spelled right. And so some of that exchange of trade and ideas with the Middle East, this led to a rebirth and a rediscovery of old knowledge from the Greeks and Romans. The Arabs preserved the knowledge of the Greeks and Romans, their books and whatnot, and this led to a revival in learning. Learning and art and whatnot. I suppose I should have said earlier that the thing that distinguishes the Renaissance from the preceding period preceding period from the fall of Rome to pretty much the Renaissance. They were known as, or rather I should say that from the fall of Rome to about the year 1000 were the Dark Ages, they were called, because there was violence, chaos, disorder, very little learning going on. And so this was the end of the Dark Ages, was this revival and learning and the formation of somewhat stable nations and law and order prevailing. Our next big event, this was, I believe, in 1517, I want to say. I don't have the date exactly, but it's about this time. We have Martin Luther, who was a German theological student, and he began the Reformation, which was a movement that challenged the central authority of the Catholic Church. And in particular, the practices of the Catholic Church and the authority of the Pope and whatnot. And the reason it led to that, Martin Luther was one of the first people to translate the Bible, which up till then had been only available in Latin. He translated it into German, and as he studied the Bible, he noticed that many of the Catholic Church's practices were at odds with what was in the Bible, and this is what led him to challenge the authority of the Catholic Church. So this led to the split into Catholics and Protestants, and then Martin Luther's church, the Lutheran Church split into a number that, well, there were a number of Protestant movements, some of which were mutually hostile. So we had those. So this led to Lutherans and Baptists and Methodists and whatnot. About the same time in England, King Henry VIII started the Church of England. So this was about, I think it was around 1540. You have the Church of England founded. And the reason the Church of England got started is the Pope would not give Henry VIII permission to divorce one of his wives for not providing a male heir. So he said, screw this, I'm starting my own church, and put himself in charge of it. So these two events, the Reformation and to a lesser extent the founding of the Church of England, helped end the dominance of the Catholic Church in the West. So this takes us to about the years, we'll stick around in the general vicinity. So about the year 1500 to 1600, the Middle Ages were pretty much over by the year 1500 with the advent of the Renaissance. So from 1500 to 1600, this was characterized by the growth of nations like England, France, Spain. And also exploration. So the Spanish and the Portuguese were the first ones to go in for that. And they set up colonies in different places. The Spanish ended up conquering most of South America. The Portuguese set up colonies in Africa and Asia. And also, I guess the period, call it, 1400 to 1600. As a result of the Renaissance, there was a philosophical movement known as humanism, and this was a challenge to the idea of the authority of the church. It sought to focus more on knowledge gained from experience and reason, classical source of information from Latin, from the Romans, the Greeks and Romans. So that was sort of the mood of the time. Another thing I should bring up was an important event I should try and squeeze in here. In 1453, the Byzantine Empire collapsed. So the last, its capital, Constantinople, was captured by the Ottoman Turks. And the Byzantines and the Turks had been fighting off and on for a couple hundred years. But they had slowly been weakened, and finally their empire was conquered by the Turks. And this was the beginning of the Ottoman Empire, which would end up conquering most of the Middle East and North Africa and parts of Southern Europe. I could say, you could just say by Turks, and then it led to the Ottoman Empire. So the Turks were a Muslim, had converted to Islam in the previous centuries, and they had, and in some ways they had been involved with the Mongol conquest, but that they had been battling around in Central Asia for a while. And the name Ottoman is a garbled version of the first king, whose name was Osman, and so it was named after him. Or Osman or Uthman, there are a couple ways of saying it. So, the Age of Discovery goes about 1500 to 1600. This has the discovery of the other continents, colonization, empire building. So you can just say, call that imperialism and discovery, or exploration and imperialism. In 1588, another very important year, the English Navy defeats the Spanish Navy or Armada, and this was the beginning of the rise of England as a naval power. So, beginning around 1600, England starts to get into the game of exploration and imperialism. And the British Empire continued to grow and expand over the next few centuries. So so during the period, I suppose, well, from about, we'll just take the big picture. Just going from about 1500 to 1800. England had conquered Wales during the Middle Ages, and then it went later on to conquer Scotland, part of Ireland, Scotland and Ireland. It later relinquished control of most of Ireland. Ireland, Scotland, and the name then changed to Britain, which is a short form of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And then starting in the 1600 to 1700, you get conquest in North America. And then later on, starting in about the mid-1700s, it starts to conquer India, or what is today India. The political system in England went through a lot of changes between 1200 and 1600. In 1215, you have the Magna Carta, which was a document that King John of England was forced to sign. And this was the first document in the history of the world which limited the power of the king. And it led to the creation of the British Parliament, which was at the beginning just a collection of lords and nobles who would vote on things. So this led to Parliament. And the power of Parliament grew over the next few centuries. By the time we get to 1600, or rather the mid we lose this 1630 to 1650. You have the English Civil War, which is where the Parliament, it was a war between those who were loyal to the king and those who were loyal to the Parliament. The king had tried to dissolve Parliament and impose his will on the country. I believe his name was Charles II. So we had a civil war with supporters of Parliament. So it was Parliament versus the king, basically. The parliamentarians won, and for a brief period, the man in charge of the country was a guy named Oliver Cromwell. But the English ruling family was restored in, I believe it was 1688, and so England continued on as a monarchy after briefly having this other political system. And all that is important because it had a lot of influence on the political system that was to form later on in the U.S. So from the period of about 1600 to 1700, we had this thing called, well, let me back up a little bit. A lot of these sort of eras kind of overlap, so it can be hard to sort of pick them apart. So going from about 1500 to 1700, we have the scientific revolution. And it wasn't really one event, it was just a series of important discoveries that happened fairly close together. So the first major events, you have Galileo, who, building off the work of Copernicus, proved that the Earth goes around the sun. And then you have Kepler, who figures out the laws of planetary motion. Much later, in the 1600s, you have Isaac Newton, who figures out the laws of motion. And there was also a lot of growth in knowledge in fields such as mathematics during this time, growth in knowledge of geography, and so on. And this kind of sort of go building around the same time, or actually a little bit later, from about 1700, or it's about, call it 1600 to about 1800. The scientific revolution led to a period in Europe known as the Enlightenment. So based on all this new scientific knowledge flooding in, there was a movement away from trusting the traditional sources of authority, such as the church and the king, and more towards trying to reason or think things through. So this is sort of like, the Enlightenment was basically humanism round two. So, similar idea. Except the political consequences of the Enlightenment were far more influential. And so the main political result of the Enlightenment was the French Revolution. So France had come out of the Middle Ages as a unified nation out of all the smaller squabbling kingdoms it had been in previously. And so the The cause of the French Revolution was that the king of France at that time, like his predecessors, had been taxing people and abusing his authority and being a tyrant. So the tyranny of the monarchy was the main cause. So the French Parliament forced King Louis XVI to agree to a series of demands, but that it was not enough to hold off the chaos. So in 1789, he was overthrown and later executed. And so what followed after this was a reign of terror, a period of chaos and killing and that consumed most of France. And it only came to an end with the rise of a French general named Napoleon. So Napoleon brought order to the chaos and ended up being the ruler of France. He didn't call himself king. I think he ended up calling himself emperor, but he basically filled in the power vacuum left by the departure of the monarchy. I believe that's how you spelled. I hate that word and I can never spell it right. I'll just call it the power gap. And of course I'll say that I'm skipping over things. I'm trying to just hit the most important stuff because I want to tell this as a coherent, rather straightforward story. And of course, the history of this is all fascinating. The history of the French Revolution in particular is pretty entertaining stuff. So, something to read about there. And then, so the Napoleonic Wars caused all kinds of chaos in Europe. Napoleon ends up being defeated. And then in the post-war conference, the borders of Europe are stabilized. And they remain pretty stable for the next 100 years or so. And the agreement that led to this stabilization of borders was the Congress of Berlin. This takes us to about the 1840s. So in 1848, or rather, let me back up a little bit there. I skipped over something kind of important. So from about 1750 to 1850, we have something called the Industrial Revolution. It began in Britain with the invention of the steam engine, which revolutionized the production of coal, textiles, and so on. So this led to a new class of factory workers in cities. So you have factory workers in cities. And also the growth and the prosperity of the nations that are now industrialized. So Britain, and later on France, and they grew more powerful as a result of their industrial might. But there was discontent as a result of the conditions in factories and how peasants had been forced off their land to work in them. That there was something in Britain called the enclosure movement, where land peasants had been living on for generations. They were booted off the land, and they had to find jobs in the cities and towns, working in factories usually. So there was a discontent among workers. And in 1848, it sort of boiled over in a number of countries in Europe and France and Germany, or the various German nations, and in Austria you had populist revolutions. They were all put down, but it was a a demonstration of the discontent of the workers. And a thinker who spent a lot of time studying this, is a fellow named Karl Marx. So he was a German thinker. He was a minor bureaucrat in Prussia for a while, and then he later on became an author and a philosopher. So he came up with the idea of communism. Sometimes it's called Marxism or socialism. I mean, they're just sort of different names for the same thing. So the gist of communism, or rather Marxism, is that he saw that society was increasingly being divided between non-working owners and non-owning workers. So basically, bosses versus workers. And he theorized that the discontent this caused would eventually create a new society where there would be no classes, such as workers and what he called the bourgeoisie. There would just be one class. And he worked the rest of his life on how this revolution could be brought about. His ideas would later form the foundation of the revolution in Russia, but that's a long way off at the moment. That was about the time Marx was getting into things. And then throughout, let's see, in the 1870s, you have Germany and Italy finally become unified nations. So Germany had been a series of smaller squabbling kingdoms and city-states for a long time. There was a growth of a nation known as Prussia, and throughout the 1700s and 1800s, Prussia slowly grew and expanded its territory and eventually ended up unifying the entire country. And in Italy, there was a similar process. There were, various kingdoms and city-states, and they were unified, beginning with a war in the 1870s. From about 1880 to 1900, we have the scramble for Africa. So Africa was pretty much one of the few places left on Earth that hadn't been colonized yet. And so Africa got chopped up among the British, the French. The Portuguese already had a big part of it, the Portuguese got there first and had Angola, what is today Angola, and Mozambique, and some of the islands. The British ended up getting big chunks of southern Africa, eastern Africa, West Africa. The Belgians got most of Central Africa. The Germans got pieces of East Africa. So pretty much the only place on the continent that wasn't colonized was Ethiopia. And the Italians tried to conquer Ethiopia but failed. So that takes us all the way up to about the outbreak of World War I. So in the late part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, you have all these new nations growing and expanding and forming empires, and they also entered into various alliances with each other. And as a result of this system of alliances, if one nation got involved in a war with another, it pretty much dragged them all in. And that's exactly what happened in World War I. So what happened was there was an empire in Europe called the Empire of Austria-Hungary, and one part of that empire was a country called Serbia. So Serbia wanted to be independent of Austria-Hungary. Or rather, revolutionaries in Serbia wanted independence. Oh, sorry, I've messed that up. There was a small nation named Serbia, and then a larger empire known as Austria-Hungary. And they were fighting over a region called Bosnia. Serbia, it was part of Austria-Hungary, but most of the people who lived there were Serbs, so the Serbians thought that province should belong to them. And so there was a man who tried to, who assassinated the leader of Austria-Hungary, known as Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And as a result of this, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. However, Serbia was also allies with Russia. Russia was allies with France, and France was allies with England. So when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, France, Britain, and Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary. And since Austria-Hungary was allied with with Germany and Italy, those two nations declared war on France, Britain, and Russia. So this leads to World War I, which was a big grinding stalemate. I should also say the Ottoman Empire. Well, let me quickly review the lineup. So you had the Triple Alliance, or Entente. So that was Britain, France, and Russia. On the other side, you had Germany, Austria-Hungary, which I'll call AH, and then the Ottomans. So this war dragged on as pretty much a big bloody stalemate. Russia threw in the towel in 1917 as a result of the Communist Revolution. So Russia was not doing very well in the war, and it caused a lot of suffering and discontent among the people. The Communist Party of Russia, led by Vladimir Lenin, staged a revolution, and they took over the country. And the Communist Revolution in Russia ended up being a big bloody mess. Much repression, starvation, suffering, millions upon millions of deaths as a result of it. And it's all a very interesting history, but I'm not going to get too much into it there. And also another thing that happened in 1917 was the U.S. entered World War I on the side of Britain and France. And Germany and Austria end up surrendering. But Germany ends up getting the brunt of the blame for the war, as given in the Treaty of Versailles. So the Treaty of Versailles was the treaty which ended World War I, and it stuck Germany with all kinds of costs and reparations to pay for the cost of the war. So that Treaty of Versailles caused a lot of suffering and resentment in Germany. Another major consequence of World War I is the Ottoman Empire collapses, and we have the new nation of Turkey taking most of its territory. The Ottoman Empire falls, so you get all these new countries in the Middle East, like Syria, and Syria became a new nation, Lebanon, countries in North Africa like Morocco and Libya, they became independent. or actually it's now, Morocco was a colony of France at that time, forget that one, but the Ottoman Empire collapsed and these new nations formed in the vacuum, and Turkey was the most important one. And that's the main thing there. I suppose I should have mentioned this a little bit sooner, but what kept the Ottoman Empire out of Europe, the main thing, that they tried many times to increase their territory in Europe, but it was, I believe, I want to say 1680 something. I think it was 1680. Yeah, there was the siege of Vienna in Austria. And so the Ottoman Turks tried to conquer Vienna, and they failed. And so this was the last major incursion of the Turks in Europe. So after this time, the Ottoman Turks' possessions in Europe slowly withered away. They had been withering away beginning in the 1700s or so, and by the time World War I started, they were pretty much just, well, they controlled a few parts of the Middle East, and no, that's pretty much it. Okay, so getting back to the consequences of World War I. So we have resentment in Germany as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. It's beginning in 1929. We have the Great Depression, which affects the whole world. And this makes things even worse for the German people. And this leads to the rise of fascism. So fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. So in the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler in Germany had been reconquering lands that had been given up as a result of World War I. Excuse me. And since the people of Europe, the leaders of Europe, were reluctant to have another war, a mere 20 years after the most destructive one, up until that point in history, they sort of let Hitler have his way. Let's see. But Hitler eventually invades Poland, and so World War II begins with that. I like to use Roman numerals instead. We have World War II. So the Allied nations, we have, first it was just Britain, France at the beginning in 1939, and then later they were joined by the US and the USSR, or the Soviet Union, later on. And then on the Axis side, you had Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. And a few other smaller nations joined in, like Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary, joined in on the Axis side in 1941. But these were the main nations. Italy was knocked out of the war pretty much by 1943. Their army was just the morale was not good. They had poor leadership, and they just did not get very far. Although it was a very costly war, it was about 60 million people were killed, most of them in the Soviet Union. Germany and the Axis powers were defeated. So Germany was mostly defeated as a result of having to fight the Soviets. The Soviets greatly outnumbered them. They fought a war of attrition, and although the Soviet losses were great, they did eventually manage to defeat the Germans and occupy Berlin, their capital. So with the end of World War II, we have the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. And this leads to the beginning of the Cold War, which was a series of a long period of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The war had devastated pretty much everyone else, so the only two major powers left in the world were the U.S. and the Soviet Union. In Europe, the western part, which was friendly to the U.S., they formed the alliance of NATO. And then in Eastern Europe, which was controlled by the Soviets, you had the Warsaw Pact. So although the communists dominated Eastern Europe, there were uprisings against them. There was, in 1956, the Prime Minister of Hungary declared that his nation was leaving the Warsaw Pact and becoming neutral. The Soviets invaded and crushed the revolt and put in a pro-Soviet dictator. And then in the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia, in 1968, a similar thing happened. The communist leader of that country, Alexander Dubček, introduced a series of reforms to soften the harsher policies of communism, and his country was invaded and he was deposed. So those were anti-communist revolutions in Europe. Elsewhere in the world, there was the Korean War, which pitted communist forces backed by the Soviet Union and China versus anti-communist forces led by the U.S. In Vietnam, you have a similar situation. The Soviet Union supported the communist North Vietnamese, and the U.S. supported the anti-communist Southern Vietnamese. So that was going on. Communism began to weaken during the period from about 1970 to 1991. 1991 is when the Soviet Union broke up. And the main reason for this decay was that they were running out of money. So war had drained the Soviet economy. So all that money they had spent trying to prop up communist governments in other countries had drained their economy. In theory, it was drained by the war in Afghanistan. And also there was a growing discontent among the Soviet citizens themselves. So not just in the Soviet Union, but also in the communist nations of Eastern Europe. So the events that led to the end of this pretty rapid in succession. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Or rather, it was torn down, which reunited East and West Germany. And then about the same time, communist governments in Eastern Europe, such as Romania and Poland, were being overthrown. And then in the big year, 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved. So that was the end of communism in Europe, and to a large extent the end of communism in the world. since the Soviet Union was the world's major communist power, that with its collapse, the world of communism was pretty much on life support ever after. Well, China is still technically communist, although I think it would be more accurate to call them fascist, since they allow some degree of private property. It's just a one-party fascist state now, I'd say. Okay, and with the end of the Cold War, we have the growth of the European Union. So it began in the 1950s, where nations of Western Europe entered into a series of economic agreements with each other, and that boosted prosperity. With the end of the Cold War, many nations in Eastern Europe joined them, and then this led to the launch of the euro, the common currency for the European Union. So after kind of amazing that bare 50 years after horrible bloodshed, Europe has become rather peaceful. The only real trouble spot is the Balkans. And so the reason for that was the nations in Southern Europe and the Balkan Peninsula were originally, most of them were part of something called Yugoslavia, which was a communist nation. When communism collapsed in Yugoslavia in the early 1990s, you had all these new countries, and they began squabbling for territory and power. And this led to a series of wars. There was the war in Bosnia, and then the war in Kosovo. So things have calmed down since then, but there was a troublesome period for a while. So what is the future of Europe? Well, I suppose I should maybe back up a little bit.